Hi there, Year 7. Hopefully you're ready for this week's instalment. You will notice that when you log on to assignments this week, you have 2 assignments to complete, and during this video clip, those activities will be discussed and explained. You have 3 parts to assignment 1 and 2 parts to assignment 2, but you also have a gunpowder plot quiz to complete. How harsh. No, honestly, assignment 1 is just sort of 3 smallish activities for you to complete. It's just notes, source work, spider diagram. Assignment 2 is filling in a table and answering some questions, and your gunpowder plot quiz is just testing your knowledge on the gunpowder plot. Okay, so let's get started. Today's lesson focuses on Charles I and the early years of his reign. Now, Charles I is the son of James. James dies in 1625, and his successor to the throne... just gone on to the next slide there, sorry about that. His successor to the throne was Charles, his son. James bequeathed Charles a fatal belief in something called the divine right of kings, which is a key word for this lesson, which we'll be looking at in a little bit more detail later on. You might already know what that means, and that's great if you do. He also his legacy was that Charles also had a disdain or a dislike of Parliament, which ended in the execution of Charles I eventually, and the abolition of the monarchy completely for a short while. In this lesson, we're going to focus on Charles during his early years and his first 4 or 5 years as King of England, and in particular we're going to look at his relationship with Parliament. So if you could please pause me now or soon to copy down the title and the learning objectives. That would be good. You are going to be inferring meaning from sources during this lesson, both written and visual sources. You'll also need to make links or find similarities between Charles's personality and the problems that Charles caused or perhaps made worse during his reign. You'll finally need to analyse relations between King and Parliament up to 1629 to identify causes of sources of tension between the two of them. The first piece of work which you need to complete for assignments this week, other than the gunpowder plot quiz, which you also need to complete, is to look at the paintings here and write a list of adjectives you would use to describe the image Charles is trying to portray or show of himself to people. So pause me in a moment to do this. You might write things down, for example, like he was rich or he wore rich clothing. Okay, that's the kind of thing you might write down. So pause me now. And we're back in the room. You'll probably have written things down like he was youthful, or he was trying to make himself appear youthful to people. He was holy, godly. One of the paintings shows sort of light shining down from the clouds, from the sky, and a crown being handed to him. That's very much to do with the divine right of kings, which we'll be discussing in a short while, and certainly made Charles look as if he was very holy, very important, and his power was given to him by God. You might have things like wealthy, rich, powerful. You also might have perhaps studious, or well educated, because there's one there of him reading a document. You might have fashionable, because at the time the type of thing he was wearing in some of those paintings would have been considered very fashionable. Okay, moving on. We're now going to look at 2 sources, so this is the next part to assignment 1. They were written or spoken by James to his son Charles, and the reason we're looking at these during a lesson on Charles is because we want to really understand how Charles got the idea that he was so holy and so godly and so important, really, and quite arrogant. So you need to read through the sources. I'll have a look through them with you and then answer the questions. So source A, the provenance of source A, or who it's written by, it's a letter written by James to his son Charles. And it says, learn to know and love God, because he made you a little God to sit on his throne and rule over other men. So it's basically saying that God has made Charles a mini God. You then look at source B, and the provenance of source B is James I speaking in 1603, so it's a speech Charles would be aware of. It is not lawful to argue with the king's power. It is contempt in a subject to say that a king cannot do this or that. Kings are the makers of laws, and as the king is overlord of the whole land, so he has the power of life and death over every other person that lives in the land. So that source is basically saying that the king is incredibly powerful. And I guess because he's the maker of laws, I guess he's sort of above the law. So question 1 says, what can you infer from these two sources about the way in which James raised his son? So you should use a quote from each of the sources to answer that question, and it should be a few sentences long. You then have to answer, what impact do you think this ideology, that simply means James's beliefs, might have had upon Charles as a person and a king? Now for that question you can choose to use some extract from the sources if you wish to, or you don't have to. You can just explain the ideology that James had, or you believe he had, from looking at these sources, and how that might have impacted upon Charles. Okay, so again, if you can pause me and complete these questions, that would be fantastic. Okay, so both James and Charles believed in something called the divine right of kings, which is something I've already mentioned. Now, if you already know what this is, great. If not, we're about to discuss what it means. The divine right of kings suggests that a monarch, king or queen, has the right to rule by direct authority from God. So God has given them the right to be king or queen. The king is therefore not subject to earthly authority, so such as parliament or laws, making the king above the rule of law and giving him absolute authority to do essentially whatever he wishes to. This obviously made both James and Charles quite confident and arrogant, I would say, as well. James was pretty diplomatic though, and he wanted to be the peacemaker king, Rex Pacificus. So although he thought he was above the law, he tried not to ruffle too many of Parliament's feathers and was wiser than Charles. Even if Charles knew something was a bad idea, he would still go ahead with it because he believed he was God's representative on earth and he was above the law, whereas James would think, hang on a second, this is going to cause an awful lot of trouble, it's not going to go down very well, therefore I'm not going to do it. An example is a prayer book which both of them wanted to introduce. James decides, he sort of takes the feelings of quite a large proportion of the nation and realises actually this is a really bad idea, I'm not going to do this, whereas Charles unfortunately doesn't do that and just goes ahead with it anyway because he thinks, I'm king, I can do what I like, and that doesn't really work out very well for him, as we shall see in next lesson. Okay, so I'd like you to watch the following video clip, please, and make some notes while you're watching it. Here are just a few of the things that you might like to make a note of. So the things that I've already written down as suggestions for you. So you want to have a side heading of problems and personality of Charles in his early years, and we're trying to make links between Charles's personality and the problems he might have caused or made worse, I guess, as a result of his personality. So you've got things written down there which you will come across in the video clips, such as he was shy and lonely with a stammer. He was a strong believer in the divine right of kings. He waged war, caused problems with Parliament, they refused to grant him money, and he repeatedly dissolved Parliament. That means ended a parliamentary session, okay, and he was arrogant, Okay, so I want you to watch the video clip and create a spider diagram or a set of notes on Charles's problems and his personality. Did one thing cause the other? And you can pause me now and do that, please. Okay, off you go.
Charles I, the only British king to have his head chopped off. He fell out with his parliament. He pitched his country into civil war. Was he the victim of a bloody coup by power-hungry commoners determined to bring down the monarchy, or was he simply the victim of his own arrogance? What drove Charles was his belief in the divine right of kings, his conviction that he alone, appointed by God, could rule the land. And it was precisely his fervour for absolute monarchy that led his country to become a republic for the first and the only time. In 1603, James VI of Scotland moved from Dunfermline Palace, just outside Edinburgh, down to London to become James I of England, successor to the Virgin Queen Elizabeth. But one member of James's family was left behind, his youngest son, Charles. He was just 3 years old, and he'd been so sickly as an infant that no one expected him to survive. His health was still so fragile, his family didn't dare subject the poor little boy to the arduous journey south. Luckily, that wasn't a problem, not in terms of the succession at least. Charles's elder brother Henry was next in line for the throne. He'd been strong and healthy from birth, and he was being groomed in London to be the model prince, charming, athletic, intelligent. Charles, by contrast, had a rather introverted childhood, moving from one royal palace to another in the company of his tutors and his guardians. But all that was going to change. On the 6th of November, 1612, his brother Henry succumbed to a mystery fever and died. Charles, the weakling prince, was heir to the throne, and that year he suffered a second blow. His sister Elizabeth married Prince Frederick of Bohemia and sailed away to the continent to live with him. Charles, aged 12, was now alone. The teenage Charles, who came to London, was a painfully shy and solemn young man. He'd blush when strangers spoke to him, and he suffered from a stutter. He was also rather short of stature, never growing to more than 5'4". But the knowledge that he'd be king put iron in his soul. To get rid of his stammer, he used to talk with his mouth full of pebbles. So much for 17th century speech therapy. And in order to boost up his frail physique, he'd go running around here, St. James's Park. James I, Charles's father, was a frivolous character who was happy to leave the business of running the country to his advisors. He taught his son that a king had a divine right to rule, but that was all they agreed on. The serious Charles was embarrassed by his father's fun-loving ways. This basement cellar of Banqueting House in Whitehall was one of the favourite haunts of James I, and it was a bit of a dive. Here the old king would carouse in the company of lightly clad ladies and hard-drinking men. Charles grew more and more disgusted. A young man called George Villiers, the son of a penniless squire, was James's favourite, and rumours abounded of their homosexual love affair. People gossiped that Elizabeth was a king, now James is a queen. James was unabashed. Within 3 years, he'd made Buckingham an earl. But Buckingham was no fool. He took care to ingratiate himself with the young Charles, and when James died in March 1625, he smoothly moved in as the new king's closest advisor. Buckingham went to work. He found Charles a wife, the French Catholic princess Henrietta Maria. Charles was enchanted by her, and soon after he became king, they were married. But the relationship rapidly declined. Henrietta found Charles inhibited and cold. He found her sulky and spoilt. After 6 weeks they parted, only to meet and then quarrel again. Charles's moody wife was not his only preoccupation. Like most English kings before him, Charles saw war as the means of exercising his powers. Encouraged by Buckingham, he set his sights on Spain, which had inflicted a series of slights on the English crown. In June 1625, Charles summoned Parliament to raise the money for war, but the Commons, composed of landowners and wealthy merchants, refused him, more from distrust of Buckingham than of the new young king. For Charles, this was a challenge that he had to break. He believed almost fanatically in the divine right of kings, his God-given entitlement to honour and obedience from his subjects. He was convinced that he knew best, and no commoner, not even those in Parliament, had the right to challenge him. When Parliament refused his request for more money, he took it as a personal affront to his status. So he dissolved it. It seemed no big deal. Kings had dissolved Parliament before, and a year later, in 1626, Parliament met again. Among its members was one Sir John Eliot, who loathed Buckingham and called for his impeachment. Charles responded by once again dissolving Parliament. Buckingham's influence was stronger than ever. He now persuaded Charles to go to war in support of French Protestant rebels who were under siege from French Catholics. Charles agreed and made Buckingham his Lord High Admiral. Buckingham set sail from Portsmouth with a force of 6,000 men, but the whole expedition proved a dismal failure. When he reached the fortress of La Rochelle, he found that the scaling ladders he'd brought were 15 feet too short. In today's terms, it was a multi-million-pound fiasco, and when Buckingham returned to England, he found that the people and Parliament were baying for his downfall. As Buckingham took breakfast on the 18th of August 1628, a disgruntled army officer, John Felton, who'd been refused promotion by Buckingham, entered his house. He stabbed Buckingham with a dagger. Felton was a lone assassin, but the king wasn't going to accept that. Charles was devastated when he heard the news, threw himself on his bed, sobbing uncontrollably. He blamed Parliament, and in particular Sir John Eliot, for the death of his beloved friend, and he vowed to get revenge. With Buckingham gone, Eliot took on the king himself. He stopped Charles being able to raise taxes without Parliament's approval. This was the final affront to Charles's authority. The king sent Eliot to the Tower. In March 1629, Charles dissolved Parliament for the third time in his 4-year reign. For the next 11 years, Charles ruled without a parliament. In some ways, he was a benign king and modernised the country. New roads were built, swamps were drained, a postal service started, and a proper attempt to find work for the unemployed was begun. And in Buckingham's absence, there was a new spark in the marriage between Charles and Henrietta Maria. Henrietta Maria described herself as not only the happiest princess, but also the happiest woman in the world. These were Charles's golden years. He was a great patron of artists and architects. He wanted to make London a new and imposing capital. Inigo Jones designed the banqueting house at Whitehall, bringing a new European style of architecture to London, reminiscent of imperial Roman buildings. The ceiling of Banqueting House was painted by Rubens and exalted Charles's kingly status. In one section, he's portrayed as a naked child, supported either side by the figures of England and Scotland. But the public resented Charles's extravagance. They complained of his squandering away many millions of pounds upon rotten old pictures and broken-nosed marbles. The criticism was not just about his spending habits. Many believed he was too arrogant and powerful. He needed taking down a peg or two. It was another of Charles's spending sprees that precipitated his downfall. Henry VIII's vandalism against the monasteries had left many great religious buildings in ruins. Now, at further great expense, Charles wanted to restore them. He put his Archbishop of Canterbury, William Laud, in charge. Laud also had a religious agenda. He wanted to unite the congregations of Scotland and England, and with Charles's support, introduced the English prayer book to Scotland. This would have acrimonious consequences. The Scots thought that Charles and his Archbishop were conniving to bring back Catholicism, and they were outraged. In churches up and down the country, there were furious riots. And the result was the Scottish Covenant, a declaration denouncing the Anglican prayer book to which the entire nation was invited to subscribe. Charles's chief advisor was Thomas Wentworth, who'd succeeded Buckingham. He believed the Scottish rebellion had to be crushed. This needed money, and money could only come via Parliament. So in April 1640, after 11 years of silence, Parliament reassembled. Charles imagined that Parliament would regard his 11 years of rule as wise and benevolent and be generous with him. But he'd reckoned without the new leader of the House, John Pym, nicknamed the Ox on account of his stubborn powers of resilience. There had been a new tax under Charles to bolster up his navy, the so-called ship tax. Pym refused him any more money to crush the Scottish rebels until that tax had been abolished. Charles resorted to his usual gambit when faced with such effrontery. He dissolved Parliament. But with no other means of raising war funds, he was forced to recall it 6 months later. So, for the fifth and final time during Charles I's reign, Parliament met on the 3rd of November 1640. It was the beginning of a deadly struggle between King and Parliament. Pym set his sights on Thomas Wentworth, now the Earl of Strafford, the man who'd been responsible for persuading Charles to crush the Scottish rebels. On the 10th of November, Parliament arrested Strafford on a spurious charge of high treason and sent him to the Tower. Strafford was found guilty, but Charles's signature was needed to sign the final death warrant. It was Charles's perfect opportunity to acquire a scapegoat and avoid the blame himself. Charles refused, but then he was warned that the lives of his wife and his children were in peril if he stalled. So, reluctantly, he signed the death warrant, the tears streaming down his face. He would never recover from the guilt. "I have sinned against my conscience," he lamented. With Strafford out of the way, Pym presented Charles with a catalogue of Parliament's complaints, demanding, among other things, that Charles should dismiss his present advisers. But that just drove Charles to assert the divine right of kingship. Parliament then threatened to impeach the Queen, blaming her for her husband's actions. This was too much for Charles. He decided to punish Parliament for good. On the 3rd of January 1642, he ordered the arrest of 5 members of Parliament, including John Pym. Parliament refused to surrender the men, and Charles hesitated on his next move. But Henrietta Maria hounded him along, even threatening to leave him. "Go, you poltroon, go pull those rogues by the ears, or never see my face again." When Charles got to Westminster, the MPs had fled the House, but he'd already gone too far. Charles carried on as proudly and defiantly as ever, but he became concerned for the safety of his queen and arranged for her to be sent to Holland. It was a difficult parting for both of them. They were in floods of tears as they took their leave, and it's said that Charles rode right along the length of the cliffs of Dover, waving goodbye to his beloved until her ship was out of sight. Back in London, Pym was continuing his campaign against the king. He asked him to put all the armed forces under Parliament's control. "By God," Charles exclaimed, "not for an hour." 2 months later, on the 1st of June 1642, Pym demanded more. He wanted parliamentary control of the army, the church, royal children and law. He didn't want to get rid of Charles, but he did want to clip his power. When Charles rejected all his demands, Pym responded by enlisting an army. He never dreamt that Charles, too, would call up an army. On the 22nd of August, Charles and his supporters gathered in a field in Nottingham. The Commons and their troops were declared traitors. The royal flag was unfurled. Civil war had begun.
Okay then, so a problem that Charles certainly had was with his parliament, and the parliamentary sessions he had in the years between 1625 to 29 gradually kind of became more and more unsuccessful, I would say. So there is some information attached about the problems Charles faced with his parliament. It's information for you to read. And what I want you to do is read it and then work out where in the table the information should go. So you need to split the information into the correct parliamentary session by year. So is it the first parliamentary session of 1625? Is it the second of 1626? Or is it the third parliamentary session of 1628 to 29. So this is the second assignment, and what you need to do is just simply either print out a version of the table, which you will find in assignments. In assignment 2 I've attached it, and you need to read the information that is also available there to be able to fill in the table. Okay, so if you could read through that information now, please. I'm not going to bore you by kind of reading through it all with you. If you have any issues with any of it, then obviously contact me via email or on Teams. That would be great, but hopefully you should understand it all and be able to break it up into whether it's to do with foreign policy, which simply means dealings with other countries, issues with finance, which you know relates to money, issues with religion, which you know is talking about the church, Christianity, Catholicism, Protestantism, or other issues such as, for example, the Duke of Buckingham, who was mentioned quite a lot in the earlier video clip that you watched, and he's also mentioned quite a lot in this information as well. He did cause Charles some quite serious problems. Okay, so if you can pause me now, if you can complete that table, read the information, and then we will carry on. Welcome back. Something that's been mentioned both in the video clip and in the information you've just read is the 11-year tyranny. Now, this is essentially an 11-year period of Charles's reign where he acted as a tyrant. He sort of acted as if he was above the law. He didn't listen to the ideas of his citizens. He didn't call Parliament, and he just acted well, he just did whatever he wanted to do, essentially, largely. So he dissolves Parliament, or ends Parliament, in 1629, and he chooses to rule alone for 11 years without calling Parliament. Now, that would mean he would be without parliamentary funds or finances for that length of time. So therefore he had to find other ways of creating money and finding money. Now we're going to have a look in next lesson at how that goes down, but he does some things that are incredibly popular, such as extending something called a ship tax. He makes people who live inland pay for a ship tax when really it should just be people who live on the coast who have to pay for that. He also makes them pay for it during peacetime, not just when it's wartime. So he's essentially really bending the rules and breaking the law to a certain extent, because if he wants to make any changes to taxes and things like that, he is supposed to go to Parliament to discuss that with them. So he dissolved Parliament. It's not a new thing really, James had previously done that, but 11 years was a very long time to rule alone without sort of guidance, advice, or anybody kind of clipping his wings a little bit and stopping him from going too far with certain things. So during that time, 1629 to 1640, enemies of Charles claimed that he was an evil king who was acting illegally and secretly siding with the Catholics. However, supporters of the king argued that the changes Charles made during these 11 years actually improved the country in many ways. Charles stressed that he had no choice but to rule alone, as Parliament was ruled by evil ministers, because as you'll have seen in the information that we've read, 1625 to 29, and from the video clip you watched earlier, each time Charles tries to call a parliamentary session, Parliament want him to amend his behaviour in some way, or want to address something or change something. He's not happy for that to happen until he's granted finances, but they're not willing to grant him finances until whatever it is they want happens. It comes to a sort of deadlock, and therefore Charles chooses to end Parliament or dissolve Parliament. Okay, so the second part of assignment 2, you've done your table. The next part is to answer these questions at the end of the lesson. So based on the video clip you've watched, all the activities or assignments you've completed, the information that you've read, the table that you've completed, now can you please complete this final task for the lesson this week? I might try to set you less assignments next week because you have got quite a lot of work to do this week, but to be fair, it's not an essay or anything like that. You're just answering some questions, doing a spider diagram, filling in a table, things like that, okay? And the quiz really shouldn't take you very long to do at all. So could you please answer the following questions? 6 questions to sort of summarise today's lesson. Question 1, who is responsible for the breakdown in relations between the Crown and Parliament between 1625 to 29? Do you believe it's Parliament or the King, and why? Number 2, is Parliament to blame? Explain why you think so, or explain why you think not. Is it fair to hold Charles fully responsible? Kind of takes 2 to tango, but it's your opinion, so can we completely blame Charles, or do we have to acknowledge that Parliament are to blame in some way? There aren't really any right or wrong answers to this, by the way, as long as you're using evidence to support your line of argument from the information sheets you've been given and also from the video clip, then that's absolutely fine. Number 4, what examples do we have to suggest that Parliament pushed Charles too far? 5, is the Duke of Buckingham to blame? And number 6, why do you think the relationship between Crown and Parliament got worse once Buckingham was murdered? So after his murder, why did that really cause Charles to be very, very angry and be unwilling to work with Parliament? Okay, so you need to please complete all of the tasks that have been mentioned in assignments and on this video. If you can then upload the work that you've completed onto assignments in Teams, that would be fantastic. And for now, I will see you later. I'll see you next week, and we'll look at the later years of the reign of Charles then, and the slide towards civil war between him and Parliament. So Charles and Parliament, if you didn't already know, do end up going to war with each other, and Charles ends up being killed. So on that jolly note, take care of yourselves, and I will see you next week. Okay, fab to those of you who are keeping up with the work. You're doing really well. It's so hard in lockdown. If you're struggling in any way, shape or form, please don't hesitate to contact me, email me, send me a message on Teams if you're having any problems accessing the work or anything like that, and I will get back to you as soon as possible. Okay, bye bye. See you next week.